Live show. I am Al Lanier, and this is a live show. Again, I'm Albert Lanier, and we're live. This is that of the live show. Depending on who you are, tonight or today is the Oscars. So I'm going to do a analysis of the Oscar-nominated film from 1994, the quiz show, directed by Robert Redford, written by Paul Attanasio, both of whom got Oscar nominations in 1994 for this 1994 film at the 1995 Oscars, obviously. Quiz Show is also nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Paul Scofield and one of the cast members, and also for Best Picture. So I decided to do an analysis of the movie Quiz Show, which is an Oscar-nominated film, though it did not win Oscars. Um, and I like the idea of dealing with an Oscar-nominated film instead of just doing the cliched Oscar winner, which would be easy to do. And this analysis of the movie Quiz Show is called No Class. And it's going to be an analysis of Quiz Show, which is a movie about and based on the quiz show scandals of the 1950s. And what this analysis will look into are, I believe, director Redford and writer Paul Antoniotti's examination of the quiz show scandals, especially through the lens of class and class difference, and in some cases, class privilege in 1950s America, or in America in general. So again, the name of this special edition of the live show, where we'll be analyzing the film Quiz Show, is entitled No Class. All right. Class analysis of the movie Quiz Show. Now, Quiz Show is in reference to the quiz show scandals of the mid to late 1950s. And for those of you who aren't aware of what quiz shows were basically TV shows where knowledge was used to gain money. In other words, unlike game shows, which is basically based on one's ability to play a specific game as planned by the producers or as structured by the producers or creators, quiz shows were merely about knowledge. They were merely about one's supposed intellectual ability to provide answers to questions in a variety of areas and subjects. The TV quiz shows were hot properties in the 1950s. There were a number or a spate of hit quiz shows. The formula basically started with a show called on the radio called Take It or Leave It, which I believe metamorphosized or basically needed to become the $64,000 question, sponsored by Revlon. And the $64,000, the Take It or Leave It, before it became $64,000 question, was based on the premise of, will you, if you're on the show as a contestant, you win X amount of money, will you come back the next week and accept the challenge and compete for more money, or will you basically take your winnings and not do it, thus opening it up to another contestant, obviously. So thus, take it or leave it, right? And Take It or Leave It was a success on radio, and then it became the $64,000 question because it was a smaller amount of money back then on the radio. It certainly wasn't $64,000. So they expanded it to $64,000 when it became TV. And the $64,000 question became a phenomenon. Not only because of, because of the effectiveness of the quiz shows. Technically, according to people that were interviewed for a PBS documentary on the quiz show scandals for American Experience. Um, One person who worked on the show said they would cut to people in the audience often and extreme close ups. So you would get it about as tight as this, right? I don't want to take the camera, but let's just go and say it would be about as tight as this, so like a close up like that, pretty close with a close up. And they would do that in order to fluctuate the mood, right? But to fluctuate between the contestant and the crowd or the studio audience, and to increase tension, right? So if you cut to a member of the family in the audience, and they're like, mm, mm, yeah, yeah, and then you cut to the contestant who's in the booth, wearing his headphones, listening, and that constant, and that was one of the signature aspects of the game shows was the sort of cutting back and forth to contestants, people in the audience, family members, the contestant, and the family member. That was one of the important elements. Supposedly, the producers had looked at some of these shows, had studied every possible element at times in regards to these shows. So, looking at contestants, looking at audience, looking at the relationship between contestants and the audience. Very important, especially when we consider a movie like Quiz Show. The relationship between the audience and contestants. That was important, especially for the sponsors who provided the seed money through advertising dollars for television shows. And back in the 50s, sponsors for $64,000 question was Revlon. I believe for 21 it was a Geritol. The sponsors basically ran TV. And in the case of these quiz shows, they of course had an outsized influence in regards to the shows. They may not have controlled every single move that was going on, but they were in control fairly firmly of these shows and of television shows in general. And that changed later on. The networks basically, not just after the quiz show scandals, but much later on, were able to get control of TV shows away from sponsors. Right? So when we talk about these quiz shows, the sponsors were very involved in expressing their opinions about the contestants because they believed that the contestants would have an impact on possibly the way, not only the way the show worked and the show appealed to audiences, but also their own product, right? So it's more than likely they thought, well, we don't want someone that isn't going to work for us in terms of our product, right? I'll give you an example. Dr. Joyce Brothers on the $64,000 question. Now, Dr. Joyce Brothers was a psychologist, and she had went on the show as I think, expert on boxing, believe it or not. And Dr. Joyce Brothers was considered unpopular. I think she did well enough with the audience, but the sponsors didn't like her. So she was unpopular with the sponsors. And they were trying ways to get rid of her, right? In fact, they had. Now, one of the innovations in regards to $64,000 question was the isolation booth. This booth where the contestant would go in and not be able to hear, later on, not be able to hear the answers of another contestant. That was another show that introduced the second isolation booth, which was the $64,000 challenge, which was kind of a sequel subsidiary to the $64,000 question. Now, what happened was that you had this isolation booth. And what they were doing in regards to Dr. Joyce Brothers, they were asking her questions about not simply boxing, but about referees, in an effort to like get her off the show and make sure she wouldn't be successful. And it didn't work because she knew the names of referees too. And so what happened with these quiz shows is, in the case of $64,000 question, what they had done was basically interview the contestants, and they would ask, and they would determine what these contestants knew. In other words, there was, I think, a cobbler, someone, shoemaker, someone like that, who had been successful on the show because he knew opera, right? So one of the things that they would do is they would ask this person questions about opera. And what they would do on the $64,000 question is they would tailor the questions to a person's field of knowledge. So if, for example, you were anyone out there was a contestant and they knew something about football, right? They would tailor the question so that these would be football questions, especially certain kinds of football. Say you knew more about the offensive side of football than the defensive side, then they would tailor it to your knowledge of offensive sides of football, right? That was what they did on the $64,000 question. So essentially, what they did was kind of skirt things, right? Excuse me. So what they essentially did was they got around things by, if you see what they were doing, they weren't entirely ethical, but they weren't entirely unethical there. So they were basically playing to the strengths of their contestants. And they were asking questions about things they knew. Again, not outright rigging, but close enough to it, right? Like I said, the innovation of the $64,000 challenge was the isolation booth. So, Quiz Show, the movie, deals with what deals with the TV show 21, and 21 was another huge quiz show, another enormous hit. Not at first. The episode of 21, the initial pilot of it, was a complete disaster. It was played straight, so it was not a rigged show. The pilot was. But what happened was the contestants couldn't get to 21 because the premise of the show is kind of like the game, right? The card game. The whole point of the game was to get questions and answer questions to get enough points to, if not hit 21, be close enough to 21, right? So they were unable in that first pilot to get that show to work. It was a complete disaster, and the sponsors did not like it one iota, and felt that it had to change, and so it did change because it was rigged, right? And that was the point that has to be expressed about the quiz shows, that they were for the most part rigged, right? These were not spontaneous. These were not spontaneous sprouting of intellectual wisdom. These were carefully calculated and choreographed dramas where the contestants were, in a sense, handpicked and they were coached, if not, I would say, directed by producers. Um, and so when it comes to the movie Quiz Show, in regards to the TV show 21, the contestants in 21 that the movie deals with are Herbert Stemple of New York, who was a former GI who was going through college. I think he was in grad school in the mid to late 50s, who got on the show, meaning 21. And Charles Van Doren, who was a instructor at Columbia University. He was a literature instructor, and he came from a prominent literary family. His father, Mark Van Doren, was, I believe, a professor. I think he had written, and he had a mother who was a novelist, had an uncle who was also a writer, so a very prominent literary family. So, those were the two contestants that were not only, contestants on 21, but also the focus of the movie Quiz Show, right? Now, Stemple has stated in documentary and in interviews that he was basically coached. Sorry. And he was coached, I would say directed, by Dan Enright. Dan Enright wanted him, according to Stemple, to cut his hair a certain way, like a crew cut, to wear like a very cheap, ill-fitting suit, and to and sort of have glasses on, and to address the host Jack Barry as Mr. Barry, which was supposedly unusual because other contestants called him Jack, but Herbert had to. Basically, from what I saw in the PBS documentary about the quiz show scandals and looking a little at Stemple, Stemple's view basically was that he was giving up kind of performance. And essentially, that was what they were doing. Like I mentioned before, carefully calculated and choreographed drama. So you had two isolation booths. The contestants were in the isolation booths. Of course, they were asked different questions, right? And whoever got closest to 21 at a certain point could stop the game and thus win the game, right? So that was the point of 21, for which quiz show is based. Um, now Stemple ended up being beaten after a series of ties by Charles Van Doren, um, who came in, who after he won the championship on 21 went on to several weeks of success and beating, quote unquote, beating contestants, because of course this was a rigged game show. And not only did Stemple know the answers, but Van Doren knew the answers as well. So, but what happened with Van Doren is that he didn't just become some minor celebrity like some of the winners on these other game shows, a blip in the radar. Van Doren ended up after he was on 21 becoming basically a phenomenon, right? Here was this kind of handsome, clean cut, um, well dressed instructor of literature from Columbia University, clearly erudite, no doubt intelligent, no doubt highly intelligent. And he was sort of a success because he was showcasing his intelligence on this game show by answering all these questions in an isolation booth that was hot. Now, part of that was, as Stemple noted, was that he was coached. And he said in the documentary on the quiz show scandals at PBS that he had to pat his brow, he had to sometimes wipe, and he had to time things out, count to 10 before giving an answer. I mean, again, it was a performance. Not only a performance for Stemple, but a performance for Van Doren as well. Now, this leads us up to the movie, the 1994 motion picture Quiz Show, which was, as I mentioned before, directed by Robert Redford and written by Paul Atanasio, both of whom got Oscar nominations, though they didn't win for this movie. And the Quiz Show went on to get Best Picture nomination as well as Best Supporting Actor nomination for Paul Scofield, who played Mark Van Doren. Now, now that I've taken you a little into the Quiz Show scandals, given you a sort of preface on them, of course, the movie Quiz Show deals with 21, so it's this, you know, Hollywood movie version of the events that transpired. Eventually, there was a congressional hearing, congressional investigation, and Van Doren confessed to knowing the answers during these hearings, during this investigation in the hearings on Capitol Hill. Now, Stemple had also testified as well. Both Stemple and Van Doren had testified at one point. Now, the movie Quiz Show, of course, deals with 21. And so I've given you kind of I've given you a sort of background on the Quiz Show scandals and the Quiz Show what occurred with quiz shows on television in the 50s, right? Now, the movie Quiz Show, of course, looks at 21 and Van Doren and Stemple. But my analysis of Quiz Show is not predicated on the idea, on the nature of rigged game shows, or whether, or the the morality or immorality of that. My analysis is dealing with class, mainly what I would call class difference and class privilege in regards to the movie Quiz Show, right? And I think when we look at this movie and we look at the Quiz Show scandals, I think what Redford and his writer, or the writer Paul Attanasio, does effectively with Quiz Show is demonstrate through both the individuals, uh, Van Doren and Stemple, the cleavages in class in American society, not only in the 1950s, but I would say now, and demonstrates how they make a difference in terms of perceptions and reality. Right now, why is class the prism through which I look at Quiz Show? Because I think because I think the film makes interesting points about class in overt yet modest ways, or should I say modest yet overt ways, right? One of the ways I think that it does so is not just through the Herbert Stemple character, and we get to see him in his home at times, especially when he's visited by congressional investigator Richard Goodwin. Um, the character of now Charles Van Doren is played by Ray Fiennes in one of his early large Hollywood roles, I should say. And John Turturro plays Herbert Stemple. Um, right away, we see the sort of differences in class expressed by the way these two men look, right? When you look at someone like Ray Fine in this movie, sort of blonde-haired, very waspy, patrician, he has very this sense of ease and sense of comfort, right? Um, Stemple himself is a kind of, you know, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but a sort of awkward looking, as Turturro plays him, rather awkward looking man, or awkward man, um, with a certain amount of confidence in his abilities, but also a sense of, I believe, a sense that I think not only Stemple himself felt that Stemple himself felt a sort of injustice at what happened to him. And I think logically so, even though I don't know that you can really cut Stemple a lot of slack, the real Stemple. I mean, he did agree to be part of a Greek game show. But I think when you look at the movie Quiz Show, well, I think what it demonstrates is the unfairness of class to a great extent through both these characters. And I think it demonstrates that, one, by the trajectories of both Van Doren and Stemple. In the movie, we see that Van Doren gets on the cover of Time magazine after he wins. We see a montage of that, and his going out with very attractive woman, being mobbed by people at a location, I guess in front of NBC maybe. I'm not quite sure, but being mobbed by people, I guess, wanting his autograph. And then you have Stemple, who, after he lost, in the movie, basically he's at home watching Van Doren win every week. And of course, he goes from some degree of celebrity, which is, in the movie, is demonstrated by, you know, largely when they drop him off at home, the NBC car, drives him, drops him off at home. He gets out, and everybody says, "Hey, hurry!" in his neighborhood. That's a little indication of celebrity, even though it's his neighborhood. Now, um, Stemple had said, the real Stemple had said that he had never, I mean, there was no one outside when he got dropped off to his home. But the movie illustrates, I think, a sense of a little bit of celebrity in regards to Stemple. But it also shows the disparity, right? This, again, very patrician, handsome, good looking, well to do, clearly fairly well to do man, although he wasn't making a lot of money as an instructor at Columbia University there in the 50s. We see the treatment that Van Doren is accorded in the film through that montage, right? That's one of the aspects. There's another, and we see what happens with Stemple. Stemple winds up in the film going to the office of Dan Enright, um, and you know, basically hectoring him about um, the show and what happened to him on the show. Supposedly, um, Stemple was offered a panel show, or there were promises of a panel show, being a question consultant if he went along with the rigged nature of the show, shut his mouth. Also went along with losing to Van Doren, that he'd be a question consultant and be paid, I forget how much money. I think a couple $100 a week or something like that. I don't want to quote the exact figure. I don't remember the exact figure. But also, they were, supposedly he was also promised that he would appear on panel shows and other TV shows, and that never happened. So there's this sense of aggrievement that you see in the way Totoro plays the character. Sense of outrage, really, the way Totoro plays the character. Just checking my thing here. So we see the disparate treatment, right? Ray finds Ray finds as Van Doren is the toast of the town. He becomes this mega celebrity. He's treated extremely well wherever he goes. He's seen as this sort of wonderful, as some had said at the time, count intellectual response to Elvis Presley and his celebrity. And then you have Van Doren, who was famous for like 6 weeks. I mean, then you have Stemple, who was famous for like 6 weeks, but then is shunted aside in favor of the Golden Boy, literally because he's blonde haired, supposedly, and you know, whisked back into obscurity. And so we see the cleavage there. And I would argue that this is a class cleavage, right? Because we see Stemple in his modest home. In class terms, we see the sort of modestness, right? The sort of lower middle class essence of Stemple. And Stemple is kind of portrayed as the sort of either upper working class or lower middle class guy who's, you know, was in the military, was on in college at the GI Bill, and having to, you know, make his way through life. Whereas Van Doren comes from this rather elite, sort of intellectually elite, illustrious family, very prestigious literary family. And so when you see that montage of um, Van Doren in the movie Quiz Show, Time Magazine, going out on dates, being mobbed by fans, you compare it to Stemple, who's at home watching, and I think there was also he's testifying in front of the grand jury, which was part of what happened in regards to the quiz show scandals. There was held in regards to this situation, in regards to the scandals, and I think that's part of uh, you know, the part of the montage it's part of what we can see are, I would argue, the class cleavage at that point, right? Lower middle class to working class, having to get it, which is what Stemple did, trying to get the truth out about the quiz show scandals, and it was not believed at first, right? And then also Van Dorn, who, well, we see the treatment, right? Again, being whisked away back to his home in obscurity. Whereas Van Doren is the toast of the town. He's out and about with gorgeous women. He's being mobbed by fans, and he's on the cover of Time magazine, which was one of the perks and privileges of celebrity years ago. Less so now. I guess it's a little important now, but it was less. It was more important decades ago. Certainly in the 50s, it was. So we have that difference. We could see the class divide there and the class cleavage there, right? I think another area where we see class divide in regards to quiz show is when it comes to is actually also between the Van Doren character and Richard Goodwin, which was played by Rob Morrow. If you're a fan of the TV shows Northern Exposure and Numbers, he was a star on those shows. So we have there's a scene in Quiz Show where the Dick Goodwin character, who's on a congressional oversight committee that's looking into the quiz shows, has lunch at a private club with Van Doren, right? And Goodwin himself was an attorney at the time, you know, Harvard law grad, so quite bright, quite able. And what happened was, and so in the scene, what's interesting is his father, meaning Mark Van Doren, comes in. They're eating lunch and they're talking. And his father comes over and they talk. And his father is saying, so Charles saying, did you catch the show? He said, no, we were over at Bunny Wilson's place. And he's talking about his other friends, writers, intellectuals. And he's not into that, you know. And there's a point where Mark Van Doren, Charles Van Doren's father, is talking to Richard Goodwin. And they're talking about the sandwich that he's eating, the Reuben. I said, and Goodwin tells him he was invited by supposedly Reuben K at some kind of poker game in Omaha. And Goodwin makes a point. Yeah, there are Reuben, you know, yeah, there's sandwiches here, but I don't see too many Reubens. Meaning, basically, people like him, Jewish guys like him. And so that's an interesting, and of course Mark Van Doren says touche. So it's an interesting moment again. That, but its point actually seems directly more related to ethnicity and the cleavages of ethnicity. But actually, I would argue this is as much about class, because essentially he's someone who comes from a very different world, compared to this sort of, again, private club, slightly upper class intellectual club that, not just club that they're at, but their coterie, Charles Van Doren's coterie. This is made all the more apparent where Goodwin comes out to spend time with Charles, because they seem to have gotten, even in real life, they seem to kind of have uh, got a little friendly with each other. And there's a scene in the movie Quiz Show where he comes out to a family gathering um, out of their country. I think it's a home out in the country. And the family and other guests are at this long table outside. And it's interesting because Charles and his father and others are playing a game based on quotations from Shakespeare. And again, I think this speaks to that scene is an excellent one in speaking to the sense of class distinction that I think is prominent to a certain extent in Quiz Show. Because here we have what this sort of upper tier or upper middle class to um, more patrician intellectual uh, family is dealing in and looking into, which is doing playing this game based on Shakespeare. And I think it underlines again the very stark differences in class. Although one could argue that this is more intellectual and educational, but I would argue that it's a class distinction, right? And I think it's a nice little scene that helps again set up that point in regards to class, right? And so Goodwin is kind of he sit down, he's kind of a witness to all this. He's looking at all this and seeing it, and again, he's sort of the different guy. He's the different man, the odd man out. He's different again because of class. He comes from a different class um, uh, status and a different class structure compared to Van Doren. I'd also look at another scene. There's another scene that comes up, which I think is interesting, where where Goodwin goes to visit Stemple in his home, and Stemple offers him arugula, and uh, Goodwin declines, and it finally says, "Yeah, I'm familiar with arugula." And Stemple says, "Well, how did a guy like you get into Harvard?" Again, I would argue, even though it's a minor scene, the sense of class difference, even though they're probably people that came from the same basic ethnic background and perhaps class background, there's still a sense of cleavage there, right? You know, Stemple's a college student, of course, but he comes from a different, but he is going to a different school, obviously. Um, I think he was attending college in New York. I think it was either State University of New York or City University of New York. I'm not quite sure which. I'm not. So don't quote me on that. But he was quoting. He was going to college in New York, and so what happens is that in that scene again we see the hand in the structure of class even between these two individuals, right? Who could be said to have some maybe some basic ethnic congruence to each other, but that's about it. Because Stemple is this married college student who used to be in the military, and Richard Goodwin is this Harvard law grad who's working in for a congressional committee. Um, and again, in each of these scenes that I've looked at, what you see is most important class cleavage, right? An understanding of the differences of class, socioeconomic class, and more importantly, the intellectual aspects of class in American society. And I think that's what Quiz Show does so well, and I think hides to an extent. I mean, some of it is a little bit more open than others. But I think what it does is it demonstrates part of the different, it looks at this, I think, to a certain extent, because it helps to see why not only differentiates the characters of Stemple and Van Doren, of course, they were real men, but it differentiates the characters of, class differentiates the characters of Stemple and Van Doren, and it also demonstrates how possibly, you know, things occurred to go well to such an extent for Van Doren and not as well for Stemple. Class is sort of part of what explains that. I would argue that because of his illustrious background and his profession and his general status and where he came from, that Van Doren was a beneficiary, I think, of class privilege and of class um, advantage, right? He became the star after he became a celebrity. I mean, it helped that he was kind of photogenic in a sense, that he had a sort of um, nerdy awkwardness that worked for him. That he wasn't this kind of, that he was more easygoing and not some sort of arrogant blowhard. Um, I think a lot of that helped his personality, but I think also what accounted for it was his class status and his class structure, and I think that attributed, and I think that's what I see, especially in the movie Quiz Show, is this class privilege and class advantage in the way that Van Doren is framed, right? Because he is, of course, a sympathetic though flawed protagonist because he was considered the great hero because he had won what more than $100,000 over the weeks that he had been on the show, and later went on to become part of the Today Show on NBC and be involved in other endeavors, for which he was paid pretty good money. So it wasn't simply, and I would argue, in real life as in the movie, using the movie, that I don't think that would have happened if it was a sort of lower middle class, working class guy like Herbert Stemple. I don't think he would have been on the cover of Time. I don't think he would have been offered a contract with with NBC's Today Show. I don't think he would have had the opportunities. Now, granted, it's different. Stemple was I think, a grad student at the time, but he was a college student. He wasn't a professor. He was an instructor. Um, but you look at when it comes to this movie, class is a very important tool in not only separating the characters but demonstrating how very different they were and how very different their fates were. And that's the fascinating thing about Quiz Show is the role that class plays. In Quiz Show, I think I think fundamentally when I look at a film like Class Show is about Sorry, not Class Show. Quiz Show, not Class Show. But Quiz Show, I would argue, is partly a film about the unfairness of certain aspects of American life. In the case of the Quiz Show scandals, there was an unfairness. Now, again, I'm not terribly sympathetic toward Stemple himself, um, because I think he knew what he was doing in terms of getting involved with the game show. The quiz shows. But you also have to. I think you also So I think he was responsible and bears culpability for his role in it. But I think you also have to have, um, I think you also have to give him some credit. You know, Stemple for his own reasons, whether you like his reasons or not, whether you agree with what he did or not. Stemple did try to blow the whistle on it. He went out of his way to do it. He went to the newspaper, eventually testified in front of the grand jury. He testified in front of Congress. He tried to make this happen. Eventually, in the real quiz show scandals, it was, um, I think, the beginning of the end with the quiz shows in terms of the scandals was a show called Dotto, where a contestant, Edward Hilgemeyer, had found that one of the contestants on the show, I think he was supposedly a backup contestant, he saw one of the contestants go out. She was kind of giving the answers. She had been looking at a book backstage, like a notebook or something, and writing in a notebook or looking at a notebook. And what he did was he went backstage and he looked at this notebook and he saw that the answers she was giving were the same as the answers in the book. And he took the book to the press. I think I don't know, it was the DA's office, not quite sure, but and that's partly how this began, this cycle that led to 21 other shows being exposed for being rigged shows. But back to the movie Quiz Show. And in Quiz Show, again, I want to emphasize how class, getting into the last stages of this, how class gets into the unfairness. So it's not just about the cleavages, it's not just about the separation, it's also about the unfairness of aspects of American life. And that class plays an important role in perpetuating disadvantage for numerous individuals and advantage for others. We have someone in the chat. Hello. Um, and this is done in both minor and major ways, right? I'll give you an example. There's a scene in the movie where Stemple and Van Doren meet for the first time, and are on the show where Van Doren wins for the first time. And afterwards, after Van Doren is whisked away and people talk to him and so forth, um, and Stemple is walking, and there's, um, I guess it's supposed to be a page or something, a couple of pages saying, finally we have a clean cut intellectual contestant, not a freak with a sponge memory. Now, that originally, from what Stemple said in the PBS documentary, was stated by, I think, a crew member, right? In the movie, I think they're like pages, NBC, if I'm not mistaken. Look like that, anyway. But that's an indication of the unfairness factor. Stemple is a freak with a sponge memory. Van Doren is a clean cut intellectual. Again, the class cleavage, the separation, the bifurcation. But now we have the element of unfairness, right? We have the element of disadvantage. We realize, whether we want to or not, that Stemple has been disadvantaged. At least in the quiz show, it makes it clear that Stemple is disadvantaged despite his role in the rigging. As a contestant going along with it, despite his role in the rigging, he is disadvantaged. He is in an unfair position, at least in terms of the film. Now, arguing reality versus the film, that's a whole different story. I mean, quiz show is anytime you have a based on a true story or even a biopic account, it's always it's essentially fictionalized retellings of reality. That's essentially what they are. So that's what you have to look at in regards to that. But that scene gives you an idea of the complete disadvantage that Stemple has on a class level and on a personal level. He's seen as a freak with a sponge memory. And Van Doren is seen as this clean-cut intellectual type. Is it any wonder that that character in the movie is so resentful, so angry? Now, here's another interesting one. You might not think of class when it comes to this scene, but I would argue in terms of class in this scene, right? When Stemple is told to quote take a dive, right? It's now this scene is in a restaurant where Dan Enright is speaking with Stemple. I guess Stemple's having a steak. Nice restaurant. Um, so what Enright says to um, what Enright says, your ratings have plateaued. Now, supposedly, according to Stemple, this didn't take place in a restaurant. This actually took place in the office of Enright. But let's focus on the movie. So your ratings have plateaued. That's what Enright tells Stemple. And we got to move on. We got to do other things. So you're gonna have to lose coming up. And supposedly he gives him the name of the question that he will not answer. Now, as I mentioned previously when we talked about in the setup of this episode, we talked about the quiz show scandals, and that contestants were given answers to questions. That the quiz shows, like 21, were carefully calibrated constructs and that were choreographed as dramas, essentially. These were essentially calculated, choreographed, constructed dramas. So Enright supposedly tells, or does tell in the movie, Stemple, all right, you're going to be asked the question, who won the Oscar? Um, who won the Oscar for Best Picture? And your answer is On the Waterfront. The real answer, of course, is Marty, which is a movie written by Patty Chayefsky, um, and starring Ernest Borgnine, and a movie about sort of a really plain, common guy. Not, sort of a movie where that guy has a romance with, I think, a woman, but it's about a plain, not necessarily, not a handsome guy, just a plain kind of schlubby guy. In fact, not even great looking guy. But I saw Marty years ago. Wonderful movie. Wonderful movie. Um, but the real answer to the question is Marty, not On the Waterfront. And that's a movie supposedly that Stemple loved or liked a lot because he saw it like several times. And in the movie, he's like, well, no, Marty, I saw that 3 times. I can't say that. He said, for the amount of money, eventually. So what he says at one point in that scene, Stemple character basically says, if I had to give a dive from the very beginning, that'd be the story of my life. But now, after all this time, you want me? What happened? Why? And the Enright character says, it's an arrangement, right? Again, what you're seeing is a power dynamic, right? This sort of powerful or successful producer dealing with this, college student guy who's become, a kind of minor celebrity because he's been on the show. But the power dynamic between this producer and this contestant, and also between class, right? Successful producer, struggling supposed GI college student, as it was called back there. It was, on the show, it was GI college student, Stemple. And again, we see but here it's a power dynamic, right? See, we looked at the unfair aspect, characterization, in the scene where Stemple was said to be a freak with a sponge memory, instead of Van Doren's clean-cut intellectual, right? So that's the unfair characterization, or seemingly unfair characterization in that scene. Now we have that scene And previously, the scene that I'm talking about was previous to this, is the scene where the power dynamic it has been differentiated. So it and that's where I think also class manifests itself, right? Powerful producer, this contestant is struggling guy, regular guy, right? And he's got to take a dive to please the producer and make the show continue on in the ratings. Because in real life, the sponsors didn't like Stemple, and we're trying to get rid of him. They just didn't want him around. They didn't think he was good enough. Again, the idea of the impact of contestants on audiences, but also important to the sponsors because of their products. They wanted their products associated with more likely good-looking people, people who might be in the popular category, right? So there's the power dynamic and the power range right there in that scene between Stemple and Enright, right? And I would argue again, class, powerful producer, struggling contestant, right? So he's got to submit because he's been seduced by television and he's been seduced by being a minor celebrity and he doesn't want to let it go, right? It's not unusual with some people. They become famous and they love it. It's a drug, it's a narcotic to them, right? But what really happens, but when we look at this film quiz show, and I've demonstrated this in a number of scenes, is we see how important class is to understanding the characters within this film. What it does is elucidate and illuminate the very distinctive differences between Stemple and Van Doren, and also about individuals like Robert Richard Goodwin, who was the congressional investigator, and Van Doren. I would argue also, and I'll use this as a last scene. Um, let's look at a scene near as the movies begin to come to it, near the end of the movie, where you have the congressional hearings, and you look at Stemple's testimony, and you look at Van Doren's testimony. In Stemple's testimony, you know, he's talking, and he has this sort of, as played by Totoro, a sort of, again, I would say awkward, nerdy, but somewhat straightforward, rapid fire, somewhat rapid fire way. And he testifies, and what happens is they're showing like a kinescope, which was the film of the TV show in the hearing. And he's talking about the acting techniques, mopping the brow, wiping the brow that he had to do. And he's doing this, and people are laughing in the committee, in the hearing room. The people that are in the audience, the people that are there are laughing. I said, "Oh yeah, look at that. Okay, this is where I had to mop the brow. This is how to wipe it down. This is what I had to do." And I said, "Well, okay, here, look at Van Doren. Um, he's better at it than me." And someone was saying, I think at one point, so it's clear in that scene that how Stemple is seen. He's seen as in literally in that scene, he's seen as a kind of clown, right? As a kind of jester, right? Now, when you see Van Doren come in and he testifies, and he has you know, heartfelt contrition of his confession. And the members, but here's what's interesting about that scene, and this is where the class aspect really comes in, is several of the members said, thank you for coming and speaking in such a forthright manner about this, or something along that line. You know, thank you for your honest, thank you for your ability to speak on this, and thank you for coming out. Must have been hard. And there's a member supposedly that says, I come from New York too, but I come from a different neighborhood and different kind of constituents. And I see no reason in praising a man for simply doing, for simply telling the truth or doing the right thing or something along that line. And I don't know in real life if there was any applause in the committee room or what have you, but I think that scene is a nice way to end my examination of class in quiz show, because essentially that representative is basically saying, why should someone of your status, of your background, be accorded any sympathy for simply telling the truth after lying, after being dishonest? And it tells you something about how class works, the perceptions. People from a sort of upper tier, in this case intellectual family like Van Doren, can be accorded all the advantages and privileges by dint of their status. People who come from more either lower middle class to working class backgrounds like Stemple don't get accorded don't get accorded courtesy and often compassion. And I think that's a good way in which to see how class is an interesting prism. How it the class cleavages in American society, not just in the 1950s, but I would say even to this day, how people from upper middle class to wealthier backgrounds are treated compared to people from lower middle class and working class in poor backgrounds are. So that has been the live show. I'm Albert Lanier, and we've been live. Thank you for joining me.